Welcome back to our third lecture on the Tao Te Ching. In our first couple of lectures, we've been giving a fairly good general picture of the Taoist account of the way of life, of the meaningful life. We've talked about the Tao as a way of living and as a way of the universe. We've talked about the importance from a Taoist perspective of thinking about development as reduction, as cutting away, rather than as cultivating, of it striving for naturalness rather than civilization, emphasizing relativity as opposed to absolutes, negative spaces as opposed to positive spaces. And in our last lecture, we spent a lot of time trying to explore the idea of wu wei, of spontaneity, of natural, free action as opposed to directed action, as opposed to reflection and deliberation. Today, we're going to complete our discussion of the Tao Te Ching, bringing some of these themes together for a Taoist recommendation regarding how to lead life. We're going to talk about the relationship between the Tao and the nature of the universe, some of the subtle characteristics of the Tao, and the subtleness and the suppleness of a truly virtuous life. We're going to emphasize the pure negativity of the Tao. That's going to be one of the most challenging ideas for us. And hopefully see why a Taoist account of life is an account of life as rather beautiful, but one that requires us to appreciate our lives as delicate and admonishing us to live with a certain kind of delicacy in our lives. So let's turn now to a Taoist account of the nature of the universe. This might strike you as a little bit surprising, but it's going to have some nice resonances. So I'm going to read from chapter 5 right now. Heaven and earth are heartless, treating creatures like straw dogs. Heartless is the sage, treating people like straw dogs. Pause on that for a moment. What do we mean by straw dogs? That's an important thing to see, because if you don't understand what the metaphor is, then the verses mean absolutely nothing. Straw dogs were used in Chinese rituals as kind of sacrifices, as symbols for impurities or impieties, so that in rituals one would take the straw dog and burn it up and then be rid of it, so that it would be a way of expiating one's sins. And so when the text says that heaven and earth are heartless, treating creatures like straw dogs, and heartless is the sage, that is the ideal person, treating people like straw dogs, it means that as far as the universe is concerned, we are quite dispensable. The universe is not committed to keeping you around for eternity. At some point, you're gone and that's it, you're forgotten. Nobody's going to think about you any more than anybody thinks about that straw dog who was sacrificed last year. And the admonition is, it's not just the universe that's like this, but that if you want to lead your life sensibly, think about people like straw dogs, including yourself. Now, this might sound very, very strange indeed, but we now have enough good philosophy and enough discussion of a meaningful life under our belt to unpack this and see that there's actually a great deal of wisdom in here. And to unpack that, I'd like you to pay attention to two texts we've examined. One of those is the book of Job, and the other one is the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, because both are extremely relevant here. We saw that part of the message of the book of Job is the idea that the universe really isn't constructed around me, or even you for that matter. The universe is a vast whole and doesn't take any of us, not Job, not me, not you, as so important that everything is structured around us. And that's what the text means when it says, heaven and earth are heartless, treating creatures like straw dogs. The universe is not built around your concerns. Don't think that benevolence is somehow your due. But moreover, when we say that the sage, somebody who's leading his or her life reasonably, treats people like straw dogs, it doesn't mean you should just be mean to people. It doesn't mean you treat people as being beneath concern or even beneath contempt. But this is yourself as well, treating people and others as things that are here for a certain amount of time and then gone. Nobody, not you, not me, not the person you most love, not the person you most detest, is eternal or the center of the universe. And to the degree that you treat even somebody you love as the center of the universe, you're distorting them, you're distorting reality, you're setting up unrealistic expectations, and you're failing to prepare yourself for the inevitable impermanence. That's really important, because much of what causes us suffering isn't always callousness. It's sometimes caring too much about things, or even caring too much about people, caring so much that we distort their reality, put them on a pedestal, and assume they're going to be as they are permanently. Treat them like straw dogs, and treat yourself like a straw dog. This text continues. Between heaven and earth, howl like a bellows, empty but inexhaustible. Each movement produces more. Talking only wastes it. Better to keep it inside. This is a great metaphor. Between heaven and earth, howl like a bellows, empty but inexhaustible. When you think about a bellows, you know, those devices that we use for starting fires and for keeping them going, the bellows had better be empty inside. If you try filling it, say with wool or water, it won't work. It's the emptiness that makes the bellows work. But it's also inexhaustible. You don't use up the air in the bellows once you squeeze it and aim it at the fire. So the point here again is that emptiness, background, the space in which things exist, is what we find between heaven and earth. All this space between sky and earth is there, and it's inexhaustible, it doesn't go away, and just as it's a bellows that makes it possible for us to have a fire and be warm, it's that space that makes it possible for things to exist, to be, and to change. So chapter 5 is full of messages. The universe is not rational. It's not benevolent. Remember the Confucian idea that we live in this well-ordered, rational universe, and that by ordering our lives with all of these rituals, we stay in harmony with that ordered universe. The Taoists say it's not rational, it's not benevolent, it doesn't care at all about you. As I said, this is more like Job, but on a nice positive side, and more like the Stoics. Be aware that you are here impermanently, and so is everything else, and don't look to the universe to care so much about you. And this kind of detachment makes a great deal of sense if what you want is a life of harmony. Attachment is only getting stuck in one moment of history, in one piece of the foreground, and ignoring all of space and time as a consequence. And that's why we use this analogy of the bellows, that our lives and our world is empty. It has no essence, no permanence, but it's because of that emptiness, because of that space, that our lives are full of possibilities. If you fill up the space, possibilities disappear. If you leave the space empty, there's a possibility for creative activity. When we talk about these positive things. We use words to refer to things that we've posited in the foreground. The text admonishes us, better not to talk, better to act. This theme is picked up in chapter 7. Chapter 7 reads like this. Heaven is eternal and earth is immortal. The reason they are eternal and immortal is that they don't live for themselves. Hence, they can live forever. This is a very nice point. The Tao Te Ching is admonishing here that when you live for yourself and you just kind of posit yourself as the most important thing in the world and your concerns and your desires as the most important ones to realize, you're in trouble. If you look at the world, it's treating creatures, treating everything like straw dogs. It's that lack of concern, that lack of attachment to one's own views that allows things to continue. So if you want a long life, if you want a meaningful life, if you want a life that in some sense is going to lead to endurance through positive effects, let go of your own concerns. So the text continues. Thus, the sage pulls himself back, but ends up in front. That is, if you stop caring so much about yourself, you're going to find that everything's going to work out okay. He lets himself go, but ends up safe. So important. We often think that the only way we can accomplish what we want to accomplish is to make sure we stay focused on the goal, focused on our aims, focused on what our lives are about. This text is admonishing that that kind of focus, that kind of goal-directedness, that kind of selection of ourselves and what we care about as so important is often exactly what gets in the way. And if we just sit back, if we just relax, if we just allow other ideas to flourish and others' goals to be met, our own will be too, and everything will be all right. As I sometimes talk with my students about this, I say, look, here's one possibility in the world. You know so much more than everybody else, and your views are so much more important than everybody else's, and your aims are so much more important than everybody else's, that you'd better focus on them. Or, among the billions of other people on the planet, there might be some good ideas. Well, if you really take seriously the idea that somebody else might have good ideas, and you recognize that you're one of a few billion, time to sit back and actually watch what happens. And that's what the Tao Te Ching is admonishing here. Now, a beautiful metaphor comes up in the next chapter we're going to examine. The best are like water, bringing help to all without competing, choosing what others avoid, hence approaching the Tao. Now, this metaphor of water is a beautiful metaphor indeed. As the text says, bringing help to all. But the metaphor of water is a more interesting metaphor than that. It's not just that water is beneficial. Water flows. Water isn't frozen. Water makes its way into the cracks. Water goes down into the dark places. Water is not stable. All of these things are important. The text here is pointing out in this phrase, without competing. Water doesn't compete with rocks for its place in the stream. It flows around them. Water doesn't compete with fish. It gives them a home. Water flows around things, affords things, makes things possible for others. Water doesn't compete with plants, it fertilizes them. The idea here is think about your life like water. Flow around, don't compete, make things possible for others. And that's what it is to approach the Tao, to live as spontaneously as water flows when it flows downhill. And so this piece of text continues, governing with peace, working with skill, moving with time, and because they don't compete, they aren't maligned. If you want to know what gets you in trouble, it's the competition and the putting yourself first. If you take your model as water and think of your life as a life that is designed to benefit others, that's designed to flow around obstacles, not to fight with them, that's designed to make environments for others, not to exclude them, and to facilitate the plans of others, not to block them, you are going to find that you have a life that is much more meaningful and that accomplishes much more than if you compete, push, and try to push others out of the way. Now, continuing the water metaphor for a moment, but then shifting, we turn to a lovely passage in the Tao Te Ching. And this is one that talks about the importance of not trying to go too far, the importance of contentment and the importance of moderation. Begins, instead of pouring in more, better stop while you can. I mean, after all, if I've got a cup of water or a cup of tea, I suppose, since we're in China, and it's full, doesn't make sense to say, wouldn't it be great if I could have even more tea in there and pour more in? It's just going to be spilling out all over the table and ruining my text. Making it sharper won't help it last longer. Important to remember when you're working on your kitchen knives. There's a certain point at which you've honed it to exactly the sharpness that the blade can handle, and all you do by sharpening it further is to wear out the metal. Be content with the sharpness it's designed to have, just as you should be content with as much tea as your cup is designed to hold. Houses full of treasure can never be safe. The vanity of success invites its own failure. If you don't want people breaking into your house, literally or metaphorically, if you don't want people trying to thwart your goals, don't flaunt your wealth. Don't flaunt your success. Don't put yourself up front. The people who are safest, the people who actually accomplish the most, the people who are not subject to attacks and live in harmony are those who don't flaunt their successes. The vanity of success invites its own failure, because if you parade your successes and really set yourself up as the foreground of the universe, all you do is put yourself in disharmony with those around you. And what that means is your own projects will fail. Why will your own projects fail? Because any human project worth attempting is probably a project that requires the cooperation of others, or at least for others not to interfere. And if you want others to cooperate with you, you can't put yourself always first and be plugging for your own success all the time. And chapter 11 concludes, when your work is done, retire. This is the way of heaven. Focus on the empty space. Know when to get out of the way. Know when you've done enough. Know when it's time to stop striving. So much of the good life, from a Taoist perspective, arises from moderation, arises from having done just enough and having done it in cooperation with others, giving others credit, paying attention to the big picture, not just to one's own individual goals. And then to focus on the empty space, to realize there's always more that could be done. Tomorrow there's always more that can be done. Don't just feel that you've got to keep filling that space with more and more and more. Possibilities are just as important as accomplishments. This focus on empty space continues in what is really my very favorite chapter in the whole Tao Te Ching. So now I get to read with you my very favorite chapter. Sometimes there are rewards. 30 spokes converge on a hub, but it's the emptiness that makes a wheel work. Let's stop on that metaphor. You look at a wheel. This is so good because what the Tao Te Ching here is doing is challenging your own perceptions, challenging your instinctive ways of reacting, and pointing out that what they are doing is bringing you not in touch with nature, but often out of touch with nature, because these instincts have been so conditioned by conceptual thought, language, and socialization, and that you miss everything that's important as a consequence. So you look at a wheel, and it's got the classic 30 spokes, and the rim, and all of that, and you ask yourself, what do I see here? And you say, well, I see a rim, and I see 30 spokes. It's a really great wheel. And I ask you, well, what makes that wheel work? And you say, well, it's the wood in the rim and that nice metal sheathing around it and those sturdy spokes. And you've got it all wrong. You've got it all wrong because if all the wheel were all of that solid stuff, then you couldn't put it on an axle. It's the emptiness at the hub, that hole at the hub, that makes the wheel work. And we're so conditioned by our conceptual thought, by our language, by our socialization, to focus on the wood and the metal, that we miss that empty space, which is what makes the wheel work. Always the Taoist is going to be emphasizing these occluded empty spaces on which we really need to learn to focus. The text continues, pots are fashioned from clay, but it's the hollow that makes a pot work. So once again, you go to a potter's studio, and I ask you to describe the pot. And what do you describe? The shape of the clay, the color of the glaze, all the solid stuff, right? All the stuff that's there in the foreground that you've got names for, that show themselves to your eyes. But suppose that that beautiful pot was full of clay, that there was just a solid object. It wouldn't be a pot. You couldn't put anything in it. It's the empty space inside that clay that makes it a pot. And once again, that's what we don't see when we see things conceptually. But that's what we engage with when we engage with the pot spontaneously. When we pour water into it, instead of talk about it, we pour water into that empty space, not onto the solid stuff on the outside. Our spontaneous actions reveal the nature of reality. Our thinking hides it from us. Continuing in this beautiful chapter, windows and doors are carved for a house, but it's the spaces that make a house work. After all, you might have windows and doors and walls and stuff, but if your house doesn't have space, doesn't have rooms, there's nothing you can do with it. You can't live in it. It can't shelter anything. And the conclusion of this chapter, existence makes something useful, but non-existence makes it work. Now, go way back to chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, when we found out that the relation between these two, between the Tao and all those myriad things, all the things in the world that we see and are manifest, is what the great mystery is. That we have to try to understand that relationship between the positive and the negative, between that background, the empty background, and the solid foreground. And here the Tao Te Ching is helping us make sense of that mysterious relationship. Existence as a thing, being there in the foreground, being something that we can take hold of, make something useful. If you can't see the wheel and pick it up and put it on the cart, it's useless to you, even if it's got a beautiful empty hub. If you can't pick that pot up, if it's not made of clay, and carry it around, then it's not going to be useful. And if you can't see your house and put windows and doors in it and go in and out of it, it's not going to be useful. But what makes it function isn't that. What makes it function is that empty context, the empty space in the pot, the empty rooms in the house, the empty space at the hub of the wheel. Nothing is what it is just in virtue of the positive aspect. The negative aspect is equally important, and that's what our conceptual thought occludes, and that's what the Taoist is trying to draw our attention to. So what are all of these subtle aspects in these empty spaces? Well, one of the things that we've seen is that a concern for others is the best way to advance ourselves. Self-concern, even though it looks like the way to get ahead, always backfires. So just as that we don't want to focus on the wheel, but notice the hub, if we want the wheel itself to turn, just as we don't want to focus just on the pot, but also on the hollow, if we want the pot to contain water, we can't just focus on ourselves and our own concerns and views in a social situation if we want to be successful ourselves. We have to pay attention to that social context and the rest of the context in which we figure. Just as when we think about the difference between the rocks and the water in the stream, what might grab our attention are the rocks that form the waterfalls and those dramatic places on which we can sit and have picnics. It's that subtle water that's mobile, adaptable, moving around, making homes for fishes, irrigating plants, that is actually what's more useful and what's more important in that stream. And those rocks wouldn't be nearly so dramatic without the sound of the water in the background. So too, solidity, firmness of resolve, independence might seem like great things for us, but being more like water will get us closer to our actual goals. We tend to think that if what we're doing is a good thing, doing more of it's even better. But in the background, if we pay attention to the background, we notice that moderation is always better than excess, and that it's important to know when to stop. And again, if we focus on the bellows, we see that it's the empty space, all that space inside the bellows, not the paper and the wood, that provides the real value and function. That's where the air comes from that feeds the fire. Once again, it's negative space, not foreground, that demands our attention if we want to understand the nature of reality. All of this, the Tao Te Ching argues, is very subtle, and that a virtuous life is subtle. And I want to now read a wonderful self-reflective chapter from the Tao Te Ching talking about the text itself. Text says, this is fun. When a great person hears of the way, that is, hears about the Tao, he follows it with devotion. So now you can tell whether you're a great person or not. When an average person hears of the way, he doesn't know whether it's real or not. That is, you listen to it and you think, well, this makes some kind of sense. I see how some of the analogies work. I see some of the points. But maybe there's something to all that Confucian stuff. Maybe I should pay more attention to Aristotle or something. Now the fun part. When a small person, that is, an idiot, hears about the way, he laughs out loud. If he didn't laugh, it wouldn't be the way. I like that. We always focus on what the great person, what the great sage might think, or even on what an ordinary person might think. But Lao Tzu is pointing out that the way that you really tell that you're onto something is that not only do intelligent people take it seriously, but when you tell it to somebody who's kind of bigoted, who's not so smart, who's not very flexible, they just laugh at you and think this is the stupidest thing they've ever heard. What? Put somebody else first? Don't look out for number one? What kind of an idiot are you? What? A wheel? You focusing on the hub when you should be focusing on the rim? What are you talking about? A house? You're supposed to look at the strength of the walls and the doors and so forth. That kind of person, they just laugh at you. Then you know you're onto something right. And so the point about the Tao Te Ching is in looking at itself, it's saying, yeah, from the standpoint of most social convention, all of this sounds hilarious, sounds ridiculous, sounds absurd. But it's the fact that it's so ridiculous sounding and absurd that is the best sign that we're on the right track. Because the reason that it sounds ridiculous and absurd is because it runs directly against all of that cultivated stuff that we are taught to think about and that just gets in the way. Often, the Tao Te Ching argues it's going to be what's imperfect that's best, and that what we don't have to use that turns out to be the most useful. Here's a nice passage from chapter 41 that makes that point. It says, the perfect square lacks corners. The perfect tool does nothing. The perfect sound is hushed. The perfect form is shapeless. Well, what does that mean? Well, focus on this notion of a perfect tool that does nothing. Suppose you've got a tool that you have to use all the time. You have to use it repeatedly. Well, that kind of suggests that using it the first time didn't solve your problems. But the perfect tool is the one that can stay in the shed just in case, and no problems arise that demand its use. The perfect sound is hushed. What does that mean? Very often, when we're listening to music, this is a very nice kind of example. What's most dramatic isn't the note, but the rest. Think about those opening measures, for instance, in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The notes are dramatic, but the rest is what really sets it off. The perfect sound there is hushed. So the Tao Te Ching here in chapter 41 is arguing that the Tao is not at all an obvious thing. It's a very obscure thing. Why? Well, because it does focus on the negative and the background. And for that reason, for most of us, it's very counterintuitive, and we tend to laugh. We tend to think something is amiss. Because the most obvious way to act is to take ourselves most seriously, to pay attention to the foreground and not the background. But that's what leads us astray in life. Too much rigidity, too much focus on artificial conceptions of virtue, the Tao Te Ching argues, just take us in the wrong direction. And often, imperfection is what does the best in the world. It allows us to function. It allows us to fit in. The corners in the perfect square only bump against people and skin their shins. And so the text says, when people are born, they're supple and soft. When they perish, they are hard and stiff. When plants shoot forth, they're soft and tender. When they die, they are withered and dry. Think about that. Rigidity is not a sign of health. It's a sign of death. Suppleness is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of life. The hard and strong are followers of death. The soft and weak are followers of life. So again, the emphasis is that all of this is about moving towards the soft, not the hard, the flexible, not the rigid. And the Tao is a purely negative thing. The Tao Te Ching says, those who seek learning, that is the Confucians, gain every day. That is, they learn more and more every day. But those who seek the way, the Tao, lose every day. They cut off these accretions that just get in our way. They lose and lose until they find nothing to do. That is, until they achieve Wu Wei, this complete spontaneity, this complete effortlessness. Nothing to do means nothing not done. That is, it doesn't mean complete freezing. It just means that we're able to act spontaneously. Who rules the world isn't busy. If someone's busy, he can't rule the world. That is, you've really got to be spontaneous to achieve what you want. And one of my favorite lines in the entire text, ruling a great state is like cooking a small fish. This is really important to learn when you have to administer a department, when you have to run a division, or when you have to manage a family. Cook a small fish. Keep your hands off. Do as little as possible. Be very delicate. Following the Tao is not some positive cultivation, not building something up. It's getting rid of the rigidity that arises from cultural cultivation. It's a via negativa. It's much more like Stoicism than it is like the positive cultivation of the Gita, and certainly more than we find in Confucius. It's also much more metaphysically charged than many of the texts that we've read so far. What we've got here is an account not only of what our life is like, but of what the universe is like, and of how our life can be in harmony with that universe. It's a kind of harmony that requires not positive cultivation, but again, a kind of stripping away. In our very next lecture, we're going to turn to a much later Taoist text, the Shuangzi, which is going to give us a far more explicit and sometimes more poetic, sometimes more humorous look at what a Taoist life actually looks like. I look forward to seeing you there.